Good evening. Welcome. It's nice to see so many people here tonight. Really appreciate you all coming out. Here's what I'm just quickly going to do. I want to thank a few people, say a few words about Phi Beta Kappa's Visiting Scholar Program, and introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Rosemarie Garland Thompson. I'm Louis Johnston. I'm a professor in the economics department and a member of the Phi Beta Kappa chapter. First, what I want to do is just thank a whole bunch of people for making this happen. First of all, our chapter, Phi Beta Kappa chapter, the Theta chapter of Minnesota. All the members made this possible. I especially want to thank Janelle Hinchley, Jean Keller, Kelly Kramer, and Laura Taylor for their work organizing everything from lunches to discussions to class visits, both today and tomorrow. It's wonderful. I especially want to say thanks to the staff here at the Gorecki Center at St. Ben's, who made dinner, served dinner, set up the room, cleaned the dishes, washed the dishes, did all the stuff that makes it possible for us to enjoy that table back there with all those bars that I want to just grab, a bunch of those. Thank you. And finally, a special shout out to Sheila Hellerman, chapter member, department coordinator of 5 departments, and who I call an organizer extraordinaire. She's just made this possible. So, second thing, a bit about the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program, and I'll just, this is a quote. Since 1956, the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program has been offering undergraduates the opportunity to spend time with some of America's most distinguished scholars. The purpose of the program is to contribute to the intellectual life of the campus by making possible an exchange of ideas between the visiting scholar and the resident faculty and students. The visiting scholars travel to more than 100 colleges and universities each year, spending typically 2 days on each campus and taking full part of the academic life of the institutions they're visiting. They'll meet with students, they meet with faculty members, participate in classroom discussions and seminars, and the one requirement for every visit is what we're doing tonight, a public lecture open to the academic community and the general public. And over the last 65 years, almost 700 visiting scholars have made over 5,300 campus visits. So that's a lot of visits. Finally, and a great pleasure for me is to introduce our visiting scholar. Dr. Rosemarie Garland Thompson is Professor Emerita of English and Bioethics at Emory University. She is a senior advisor and fellow at the Hastings Center, where she is also chief project advisor for The Art of Flourishing, Conversations on Disability and Technology, which is a project supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's also a 2020 National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar and, of course, a Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar for this academic year. Dr. Garland Thompson offers expertise to the community in the form of equity, knowledge, culture, and the ethics of disability to a broad range of institutions, with a focus on the areas of medical humanities, healthcare ethics, diversity, and inclusion initiatives that go beyond compliance. That, to me, is a really important phrase. Now, there's a lot more I could tell you, but I'm just going to stop right there and simply say, please join me in welcoming Rosemarie Garland Thompson.
Thank you, Louis. I'm really honored to be here and to get to know your community and your campus, and I'm honored to be able to carry forward the work of the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program. I didn't know the number that Louis provided for us here, but it's really a pleasure and an honor, especially at this time in, the history of the world here. It's wonderful to be here in person and to be gathered together with you. So I want to specifically thank Louis for all of his work. I got to see so much of your beautiful campus today. I saw the reliquaries, and I'm really interested in sacred spaces, so you have a beautiful place here and a wonderful community. I also want to thank Janelle Hinchley and Laura Taylor, who have been part of the hosting team, and I'm really looking forward to meeting more of you tomorrow. So thank you for all of that. I'm going to make this talk as accessible as I can, and I wanted to call a little bit of attention to that access practices by pointing out that part of what I'm trying to do tonight is to make this lecture available to you in multiple communication formats. So that means I will have a slide deck with images, and these slides will have words on them, and they will have images in them. And I will read the words that are on the slides, which is a best access practice. And so I will also, in some cases, describe the images that I'm showing, but I will describe the images if it matters for the purposes of my talk. When we're finished, we'll have a question and answer period, and I will ask all of you, or we will all work together in creating what I call the most robust auditory environment, which is to say we'll all use the microphone. And I'm using the microphone here in order to create a robust auditory environment. So the title of my talk today is Building a World That Includes Disability, and I've shown you two of the images that are involved in some of the things I'll be telling you. One is Michelangelo's Pieta, which shows the mother, Mary. This is part of Marian iconography, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, holding on her lap the body of her recently crucified son. So this is one of the most important images, sacred images of all of Western culture. And part of my argument and the reason for showing this image, and I'll talk about it a little bit more, is that it illustrates the pervasiveness of woundedness and disability, illness, and disease across all cultures. And below that, I have an image of Frida Kahlo's prosthetic leg with that fabulous red boot that was designed, I think, in the 1920s for her. And this has been on exhibition at on a tour of some of Frida Kahlo's, the material objects of Frida Kahlo's life. And it's really quite wonderful. And I'll speak a little bit about design and prosthetic design a little bit further on down the line. So here's a executive summary, or a summary of what I'm going to provide you this evening. So I'm going to offer you a few non-medical definitions of disability. In other words, I'll be offering you some cultural and social and political and legal definitions of disability, but not medical definitions of disability. And that's part of what we call critical disability studies and what that offers. I'll also be giving you, and this will be the bulk of my presentation this evening, and that is some of the cultural contributions made by people with disabilities, such as, of course, Frida Kahlo. I'll also be giving you a bit of a history here of disabilities evolution during the civil rights movement. That'll be your history lesson. And then at the end, I will be taking disability further, if you will, by suggesting the potential of DEI initiatives. And I wanted specifically to use the term DEI here, which is an emergent phrase. It's an acronym standing for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has emerged maybe over the last even half-decade in organizations and in educational institutions and all institutions as a justice movement in which we have institutionalized the kinds of services that people with disabilities are able to request and have as accommodations, as well as a variety of other equity and inclusion initiatives in institutions. So it's a very vibrant presence here on your campus and at any institution and organization that you participate in. So that's what we'll be doing together. I'm going to begin with a slogan of the disability rights, the disability culture, and the disability studies enterprises, if you will, and that is disability is everywhere once you know how to find it. And we're going to be looking together tonight at finding disability. But before that, I wanted to begin with a few definitions of what is disability before we try to find it. And these are a few of my own definitions. The first one is the human variations we think of as disabilities are part of the human condition that occur in every life and family and are a theme in all art and culture. And this is really what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening. And I'm showing an image here that is about 4,000 years old of a dwarf family from Giza, to show you that people with disabilities have been with us throughout all of human recorded history. Now, I'm using a perhaps awkward term here rather than just saying disabilities. I'm saying the human variations we think of as disabilities. I want to kind of denaturalize disability as a medical condition and to think about it in terms of human variation and human diversity. So I'll carry on with that kind of language throughout my presentation. So another definition here of disability. The lived experiences of disability give people and their communities opportunities for expression, creativity, resourcefulness, relationships, and flourishing. So I'm going to tell you positive stories about the experience of living with disabilities that come from life and culture and human history. Disability is, this is another definition, a set of stories, narratives, stories we receive and we remake by retelling about human variations that scientific medicine considers to be disability, disease, illness, and body-mind differences. Body-mind differences is a nice, rather current phrase to talk about these human variations. So I want to emphasize in this definition the narrative quality of disability as a lived experience, and I will be emphasizing that. I'm showing an image below of a self-portrait by Vincent van Gogh, one of our famous disabled artists, and I'll talk about other disabled artists. This is a picture of him with his bandaged ear, and a really wonderful painting, a rather contemporary painting, a portrait of a woman with significant burn scarring, a woman whose name is Shayla, and this is done by Doug Auld, which is part of a series he did where he painted people who asked to have their portrait made, people with significant burn scarring. So I've suggested that disability is everywhere once we know how to find it, and I want to spend some time with you finding disability. So where do we find disability? So my assertion here is that we find disability in all culture. We find it in literature, we find it in performance, we find it in art, and we find it in design. And these are some of the genres of representation and narrative that I'm going to speak with you tonight about. We want to ponder a little bit together, what does finding disability do? And I'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end of my talk, but that's one of the questions I want us to think about after we start finding disability a bit together. So what does finding disability do? This is my claim, that finding disability is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to explore and to redefine and to make new stories about what it means to be human. So if disability is in every life, if disability is in every family, if it is throughout all cultures and all history, it is a narrative opportunity about what it means to be human. So some examples from literature and the performing arts. Now remember, I'm an English teacher, so I am forever promoting narratives and talking about stories. So the founding narrative of Western culture, arguably, is the story of Oedipus the King by Sophocles. And I'm showing an image of, in Greek, of a copy of Oedipus the King by Sophocles and a rather operatic portrayal of Oedipus ripping at his clothes with blood flowing out of his eyes. I mean, this is a tragedy, right? These are gory things, from 1886. And I want to suggest that the story of Oedipus, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with it, is bookended by disability. For those of you who recall, the story begins with Oedipus having a damaged foot. This is what Oedipus means. And he is exposed. He's put out on the hillside, and his feet are fastened together, damaging his feet because his parents are trying to prevent him from carrying out the fate that has been declared to be what his life will carry out. And then at the end of his narrative, and this is the picture that we have here from 1896, when he does discover his fate, the truth of who he is and what he carried out in his life, he, again, rather dramatically and in complete gory detail, gouges out his own eyes as an act of blinding himself to point out the irony that he is now blinded, but he has knowledge. And so disability is, again, as I said, the bookend on this founding narrative of Western culture. I mentioned to you that disability is productive, it's generative, and I'll give you some examples here. I'm showing an image of John Milton, of course, the famous 17th century English poet, the author of Paradise Lost, and of course, Milton writes Paradise Lost while he is blind, because of course everyone will become late life deafened and late life blinded. And in the 17th century, people became blind and deaf and disabled much earlier than they do in rich Western or rich nations now, of course. So Milton writes Paradise Lost while he is blind, and the imprint of his blindness is on his aesthetic product. Similarly, Beethoven, and I'm showing an image here of Beethoven from about 1820, composes his most significant work after he becomes deaf. And deafness, again, informs the aesthetic production of Beethoven and of Milton as well. In American literature, and I'm an English teacher, so the most canonical novels of the 19th and 20th century in American literature are from the 19th century, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and I'm showing you a cover here with Captain Ahab, the amputee, the peg leg amputee captain, who is after the white whale, and he's about to spear that white whale. So disability is crucial to it drives the plot in Moby Dick, and then from the 20th century, we have again this canonical American novel, The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner, which is about a man, Benji Compson, who has what we would call now a developmental disability, and Faulkner takes the famous line from Macbeth, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury. In life writing, of course, or autobiography, if you will, or memoir, disability plays a very important part because, of course, disability enters into every life, and people move in and out of the human variations that we think of, the human experiences we think of as disability. So certainly they appear in life writing, and I'm just giving you two examples here, again, from American literature, and these are slave narratives or the life writing of the abolition movement in American literature. On the left, I have the cover here of Harriet Jacobs' book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And of course, Harriet Jacobs sustained a disability through enslavement and through simply living life. And the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, where he tells stories about how disability operated in slave culture as part of the logic of abolition in these narratives. So again, disability plays a crucial part in this abolition literature from the American 19th century, really. Disability memoir currently is very, very vibrant as a genre, and I'm showing here just some examples of some collections of short personal essays written by people with disabilities about disability. One of these is the book that I guess has been taught in a class here, and I was fortunate enough to be able to edit it. It's called About Us, which takes its title from the disability rights claim, Nothing About Us Without Us. And this was edited with my colleague from the New York Times, Peter Catapano, and it's a collection of the essays that were in the New York Times for 2 years running in 2016 through 18 of personal essays about disability written by people with disabilities. And then a more recent collection called Disability Visibility from the Disability Visibility Project, edited by my colleague Alice Wong, first-person stories from the 21st century. So if you want to read short pieces, it's good reading. From performance, some examples, and there are many, but there are long traditions, for example, in performance and music and art, and I'll show you dance too, of blind artists. This is just some examples of the long tradition of black blind musicians. Thomas Wiggins, who was known in the exhibition era as Blind Tom, was a savant composer and performer who was blind. And of course, Ray Charles, much more well-known from the American musical scene, and Stevie Wonder. All three of these are black blind musicians. There are all sorts of, there's a group, it's the Blind Boys of Alabama, who are a performance group of blind black musicians. So this is a long tradition of a musical genre. In performance, the American folk opera by George Gershwin called Porgy and Bess has a plot that turns on Porgy's disability. Porgy is a so-called cripple, and his love affair and romance with Bess is informed by his embodiment as a person with a disability. And I'm showing here an image from the 1959 film of Sidney Poitier, who died recently. What a great loss, where he is Porgy down on his knees, and a more recent version of Porgy from 2011, in which Audra McDonald and Norm Lewis do the Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, where we have an upright Porgy here. This is a very powerful performance that carries forward this important folk opera in which disability is crucial to the plot. I'm showing here an image of Peter Dinklage, who is a disabled actor, probably our most well-known disabled actor, who does Shakespeare work. He's going to be in a movie quite soon, which is a film version of Cyrano, which I'm looking forward to seeing. Maybe it's out, I don't even know. But this is an image of him from Game of Thrones, of course, where he plays a really quite wonderful villain. I'm not showing an image, but if you have an opportunity to see his first film called The Station Agent, which was written for him, it's really a very beautiful film. And on the left, I'm showing you a picture of him on the cover of Esquire, looking really dapper in a suit. And Maureen Dowd, the columnist for the Washington Post, she did a wonderful profile of him, and she called him, I think it was in the New Yorker, but she called Dinklage our first American dwarf heartthrob. And I thought, well, that seems right to me. Disability dance has emerged as a really innovative genre in which disabled artists, dance artists, are able to develop entirely new and unique movement vocabularies that come from the instrument of their body as a dance instrument, and that is people with disabilities. Here's one example. This is Leroy Moore, who's a poet, and he has created a dance genre that he calls crip hop. Get it? He is a performer with cerebral palsy and has a very distinctive set of bodily movements that, as I said, contribute to a really interesting movement vocabulary in crip hop. This is another example, and I have lots of dance examples that I could have shown, but I'll just show a couple. This is the more classic form of disability dance, and that is to say dancers who dance on wheels instead of dancers who dance on legs. And this is Alice Shepard and Laurel Lawson in a kinetic light. That's the name of the performance of the performance company. This is from 2017, and Laurel and Alice here are doing some really innovative and remarkable dance movements on the floor in this case that utilize a kind of new virtuosity that is available once the wheelchair has been introduced into contemporary dance. And some people have argued that the wheelchair has changed contemporary dance more than anything else since the invention of the ballet shoe. So I wanted to include particularly a section on a project I'm working on now, and that is looking at sacred iconography of care ethics. And I showed you this image, of course, of the most sacred Pieta in all of Western iconography, and this is Michelangelo's Pieta in St. Peter's Basilica. And of course, we have this as the classical choreography of what I would call an ethics of care. And so my assertion in this new project, which I'm trying to develop a little bit, mostly through Marian iconography, is the idea that sacred images of care relations. So what we really have there is a picture of a mother and child. Of course, in this case, it's a mother and the crucified, the dead child. But it is a care of the body pose, because, of course, women have traditionally been assigned the work of care, the life work and the death work within culture. So these iconographies of care work. I am hoping that I can make the argument that by having them be elevated to an iconography of the sacred, that they might help affirm care relations as an important element in the affirmation of human dignity. So just to show you a couple of other of the pieces that I'm hoping to work on that I think are quite interesting. I included this for you because this is the Eisenheim Altarpiece in Comar, France, which is really quite a remarkable triptych, which is not uncommon in medieval art. And I don't have a date on this because it's not exactly clear when this is. I think it's 15th century, but I'm not sure about this, and it's relatively new work. So it's a triptych. We're quite familiar with this, but what's really interesting to me is that we have a nun here in this, who is a nurse, dressed in what we would think of as a nurse's and nun's habit. And that's part of this iconography of care here. And this is one of the, it's called the Fainting Mary. So we have Mary here dressed as a sister, dressed as a nun, dressed as a nurse in this particular iconography of grief that goes along with the crucifixion. So I haven't done much work with this, but I think it's a really interesting piece. And I'm also looking into some contemporary pietas as a sort of choreography of care ethics. And I thought this one was particularly interesting, and I wanted to show it to you because we have a very interesting, we have the same choreography of embodiment that we have in Michelangelo's Pieta, but we have some interesting reversals, and that is that we have a man here rather than the Marian figure, the virgin figure, the mother figure. And we have then, and this is very realistic, of course, and then we also have an old person here who I think is to be understood as a man, but it's interesting that it's not entirely clear. The gender signals become muted later on in life. And so this is a re-choreographing of a sacred image that I think is really quite moving. And there are lots and lots of Pietas that you can find that with this particular, as I said, movement vocabulary or choreography of embodiment. So to move into art, let me give you just a few examples of where we find disability in artistic visual representation. There's a long history, of course, of protest art. This is John Singer Sargent, portrait of soldiers from 1918 who have been gassed. So this is an anti-war painting that John Singer Sargent offers of blind soldiers who are in the typical configuration that blind people also often use for navigation, of putting the hand of the blind person on the shoulder of the person in front of them. And so it's a very, very powerful image, I think. And of course, 1918 is a time that is revived for us now, of course, with these, the 19th century, 20th century pandemic and the 21st century pandemic. I mentioned to you that disability shapes the artist, and by shaping the artist, disability shapes the artistic production. I'm showing you here a late work of Claude Monet, the famous, of course, Impressionist artist. This is Water Lilies from the first decades of the 19th century. This is part of Monet's, as I said, late work. Late work from artists of all kinds is often inflected by disability because everyone becomes disabled late in life. So what happened to Monet is that he became blind later on in life, as most people do, and the more blind he got, the more impressionistic his artwork got, because it got fuzzier, just as what he was seeing got fuzzier. So we see what Monet sees in this late work. And what's interesting is that it's understood as part of his aesthetic evolution. And there's also a wonderful image here from an exhibition that I saw that has Monet's glasses in it. That was part of the exhibition, to sort of, that prosthetic device to be part of the exhibition. Frida Kahlo, again, I wanted to return to Kahlo because she did so many self-portraits, and she's most well known, of course, for her eyebrows, but in fact, she did a lot of paintings of her own prosthetic devices. This is a particularly arresting one on the right, a kind of postmodernist, if you will, fantastic realism in which her the metal in her spine is shown to be coming actually through the front of her body, and her corset, which was a very important part of her costuming as an artist and a person with a disability, is crucial in this self-portrait. And then the more classic self-portrait on the left shows her in her wheelchair, which she very, very seldom showed herself in her wheelchair. And she very often painted pictures of her doctors, and this is a portrait that she did of one of her doctors, and it's a portrait of the artist with the portrait of her doctor. This is a photograph of the disabled artist Judith Scott, who began her work as an artist in a kind of sheltered workshop where she was taken to where there was a bunch of yarn and fiber sitting around, and she was introduced to the idea of doing crafts, and she began to wrap and to create sculptures with fiber. And Judith Scott she was multiply disabled. She had Down syndrome, she had autism, she was non-speaking, and she was deaf. And she never spoke, she never commented on her work, she simply wrapped and wove and made sculpture. And she is understood now as one of the most important artists, women artists, outsider artists of the 20th century. And she had a single artist show at the the Brooklyn Art Museum, which was really quite wonderful. This is a beautiful picture of her touching one of her own distinctive sculptures. This is Christine Sun Kim, and Christine Sun Kim is a sound artist. She is a deaf, with a capital D, sound artist. That means the capital D, you may know, means that she understands herself as being part of deaf culture and using sign language, which is the indigenous language of deaf people. What Sun Kim does in her art is that she explores with a lot of installations. She explores the relationship that she, as a deaf sound artist, has with sound. And what she's trying to do is to unseat the stereotype or the belief that people who are deaf have no relationship to sound. And so she explores sound in many ways in all of her work. It's really quite wonderful stuff, and you can find a lot of it, a lot of her her installations and video work on the internet. I wanted to spend some time here on accessible and inclusive design because, of course, you have this Breuer-designed campus, and you have a campus which is designed with accessibility in mind, and you have a history here. Is this right? You were explaining to me of design, inclusive design here and in the campus, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about that later, but I wanted to emphasize some of the really interesting things that are being brought forward. So this is an image from the Alternative Limb Project. Go to the web and look up Alternative Limb Project, and you can see some of these prosthetics that are being designed by these designers. Sophie Barada is the person, she's English. And these are prosthetics that are meant to be seen. So pre-ADA, if you will, pre-disability pride prosthetics were meant to be hidden. They were meant when they were meant in terms of their design to approximate the fleshly limb. They were made to cover up disability, but the new prosthetics, of course, are designed to be seen and to be used. And there are really two genres of prosthetic design that are really interesting, and this illustrates the aesthetic design. So this is a beautiful prosthetic leg that is painted intricately with flowers and plants, but many of Sophie's designs are bejeweled and bedazzled, and they're really quite wonderful prosthetics, again, meant to be seen, meant to be aesthetic objects. I often show images of some of the new designs for, glasses for one thing, of course, which are the ultimate aesthetic prosthetics. And you might notice mine are really cool. In the masked world, it becomes your statement. But also hearing aids, which of course were originally meant to be hidden, and now many of them are designed to be hidden, but there are some really wonderful hearing aid designs that are part of deaf pride and disability pride that, have jewels and feathers, and they're meant to be aesthetic enhancements, if you will. Another kind of prosthetic that, again, I think moves in an interesting way between the aesthetic and the functional is this Eames-inspired prosthetic leg by Joanna Hawley. And this, again, great-looking guy who has on a suit, but he has shorts on so that his prosthetic leg, which is fashioned after the Eames chair that he has his leg up on, of course, echoes the design and the materials of the Eames chair, which I think is really an interesting design. And this is Hugh Hare, who runs he's an MIT engineer. He runs, I can't remember right now the name of the lab, but it's a really important lab at Harvard and at MIT. And he's got a great story. He was a mountain climber, and as a teenager, he got stuck somewhere on a mountain, and both of his legs were amputated as a result of frostbite when he was maybe 14 years old or something like that. And as a result of this, he became a prosthetics designer because he wanted to have prosthetics that would allow him to continue to be a mountain climber. So he has designed, he and his lab have designed that cheetah leg. I don't have an image of that, but I think you know this. It's a runner's leg that is shaped like this that's really very elegant, as well as this kind of amazing set of legs here that I'm showing you here. And you have chairs just like this on your campus. I saw them today. So this is Hugh Hare, mountain climber and engineer. This is Kathy D. Woods, who is a person of small stature or a little person or a person with dwarfism, and she is a fashion designer. She designs clothes for small adults, and she is a person with, as I said, a small person, so she's designed her own clothes, but she also designs clothes for other professionals. These are professional clothes of people with disabilities. This is really a wonderful gesture. This is called an ear chair, and these are a pair of chairs that are an exaggerated design of a winged chair, where the wings are exaggerated in order to enhance and to amplify the sound that goes between these two chairs. So they are, in some ways, what we might call hearing aids, in the sense that they enhance auditory communication for their users, and it's really a very beautiful and interesting design. Here is a tactile watch that is for blind people or for anyone when it becomes advantageous for anyone to be able to tell time tactily, that is to say with your hands as opposed to either auditorily or visually, the way many of us are accustomed to telling time. It's a very beautiful implement, and of course there's a certain pleasure in tactile access to a variety of different objects. And finally, of course, is the ramp, the emblem of disability inclusion, the emblem of the rebuilt and redesigned world that I'll talk a little bit more about. This is a particularly beautiful ramp. So when ramps were first mandated, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, in 1969, for example, in the United States, but also in the 1970s, and even more fully with the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, the federal government simply said, you will make buildings that get money accessible to people with disabilities. Well, nobody knew how to do that, for heaven's sakes, in 1968 when the Architectural Barriers Act was passed. But what has happened in those many decades is that architects and designers have come to create aesthetic solutions to making the world accessible. In 1968, what happened is somebody would get these really ugly aluminum ramps and slap them up on the front of buildings, and they were thought to ruin the aesthetic integrity of a building. But now, of course, ramps are built in rather than bolted on to buildings, and this is a particularly beautiful. It's a helical ramp, so it's like a spiral. It's red. It is at the very center, not over on the edge, not fastened onto the front of one of the most important buildings in Berkeley, California, and it's the Ed Roberts campus. And it's a really gorgeous thing, part of the aesthetic element of the building itself. So I wanted to, this next part of my presentation, I had suggested to you that disability is everywhere once we know how to look for it and once we know how to find it. And I want to say that access is everywhere once we know how to look for it, once we know how to find it. And to spend a little bit of time talking about how we find access, how we discover access in the world that we build together and share together and use together. And of course, the signage, the emblem, the symbols of access are everywhere on campus. And once you begin to notice them and to use these access implements, they become extremely significant in your life. And I'm showing here from 1968 the rather rigid stick figure of the wheelchair user that has become the international symbol of access that guides people to accessible paths, and the 2010 more dynamic design, which is interesting, controversial, of course, as everything in the universe is, the newer international symbol of access, which suggests, of course, here a wheelchair user with a lot more agency than the 1968 design might have had. And of course, what has happened from 1968 to 2010, or now 2020, is that wheelchairs have transferred from being medical equipment to being public transportation equipment. And they are used everywhere in the world, and it is imagined that they are self-propelled one way or another, rather than like medical wheelchairs, which were designed to be pushed by somebody else, because there was nowhere to go with a medical wheelchair, and now you can go anywhere. Okay, so a little history lesson. How did we get from what I'm calling segregation, which was built into the environment, to inclusion? So I'm going to talk about what I call the path from patient to citizen. That is to say, the transformation of people with disabilities from patients to citizens. So I'll talk about that. And I'll suggest that this is what the human and civil rights movement, starting in 1948 in my narrative here, to the present has accomplished. It's been the transformation of disabled people from patients into citizens. And so this begins, I want to say, in my narrative in 1948 with the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which comes out of the Holocaust, which comes out of the recognition of what science and medicine and war and nation states could do to inflict injustice across human communities. But part of the repair work of the United Nations was to begin the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And I'm showing Eleanor Roosevelt, who was important in this. And of course, you may know Eleanor Roosevelt was married to Franklin Roosevelt, who was our first kind of out-disabled president. He had had polio and used a wheelchair every day of his life, but not in public. Anyway, so Eleanor Roosevelt was very involved in the human rights movement starting in 1948. There were other leaders in the disability community early on. I'm showing an image here of Helen Keller, who graduated from Radcliffe College in 1921. She's a deaf-blind woman who took her accessible devices with her to college. She took Annie Sullivan with her, who was her assistant and would help her with communications in a way that our iPhones do for us now. We don't need to have Annie Sullivan anymore. And the disability rights movement comes out of the general human and civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, and I'm showing an image here of the disability rights movement, a kind of lesser-known part of the larger Black civil rights movement and women's movement of the 20th century, mid-20th century in the US and, of course, worldwide. And I think this is a really instructive, I love this photograph. It's a bunch of disabled people, some of whom I know. Apparently you had Judy Heumann here, right, to speak in a class, or she's a leader of the disability rights movement. That's her in the front. This is probably from the 1970s, mid-1970s, maybe the late 1960s. That's Judy in the wheelchair there, along with some of the other leaders of the disability rights movement. And they're, protesting, which is what everyone did, marching. And there's a banner here that says, "Injustice everywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And this is a quote from Martin Luther King. And I think this is really an instructive photograph to show about what we think of now as intersectionality, how rights and identity studies in the most progressive, the most equitable way is always an intersectional movement. In which all of these rights movements, and this is what happened in the mid-20th century, the Black civil rights movement, the women's movement, the disability rights movement, what was called the gay and lesbian movement at the time, all occurred at the same time, and they were all interconnected because they were all justice movements that came together at the same time that civil rights legislation that came from these movements began to change the world that we live in, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. This is the cover of an important book. It's called No Pity by Joseph Shapiro, who works for NPR, and it's the history of the disability rights movement. It's a good book to read if you want to know the history of the disability rights movement, which is, as I said, a lesser-known history, but an important one. So I want to offer another definition here about this, what I'm talking about, this transformation or this path from being a patient to being a citizen that's so crucial, that comes in the mid-20th century for all of us. For any of you who request and get accommodations of any kind within the institutional structure of school, or you will do this later with work, this is why this is here for you, because of this movement and the legislation that came out of this movement. So disabled people, this is an awkward definition, but disabled people are a politically created group of qualified individuals. So you have to qualify to be disabled. This is actually, or to request accommodations, to be recognized as a person with a disability, you have to qualify, which is interesting because these other identity categories, you don't have to qualify. You don't have to qualify for being a man or a woman particularly. You don't have to qualify for racial categories usually. But in order to carry out the request for accommodations that the ADA and other laws assure, you have to qualify as a person with disabilities. So qualified individuals, protected. Disability is a protected category, like race and gender and some forms of ethnicity. Against discrimination, protected against discrimination by civil rights legislation and accorded, and this is the part that's distinctive about disability law and legislation, accorded the right to request reasonable accommodations. So I'm going to come back to that move from being a patient to a citizen and what kind of rights and obligations that accords people. And one of them is protection against discrimination, and the other is the right to request reasonable accommodations. Okay? A little bit more of this history of the of the civil and human rights movements. Of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is from 1990, and then there are amendments in 2009, but there was much legislation before the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. There was legislation that I mentioned to you, the Architectural Barriers Act, and there were education reforms which provided a free and appropriate education to all students. That came in the 1970s, but the Americans with Disabilities Act was the main act which provided people with the right to request accommodations and protections against discrimination. It was very broadly created. It's an interesting law to read about. And then, of course, later we have the international treaties that come from the United Nations. So I showed you Eleanor Roosevelt with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. There is a whole series of treaties that the United Nations has offered, and in 2006 we get the UN Convention. They call it Convention, but it's a treaty on the rights of persons with disabilities, and there are many countries that have signed on to this. The United States has not, but that's a complicated conversation, but the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is extremely important and influential. Go read it if you're interested. It's much more pervasive than the Americans with Disabilities Act. But it's also, there's a question of resources and implementation in terms of its effectiveness. Okay, I'm going to finish up by talking about what can disability inclusion do. So I've suggested disabilities everywhere. We can find it. Once we find it, what is it? And now, what can disability inclusion do? Okay? So I'm going to suggest that accessible design, which I've given you a little bit of in the broadest sense, a little bit of an introduction to, creates disability inclusion by changing the built world that we share together so that it changes who we share our world with. For example, you in this room could not have gone to college with somebody who used a wheelchair, or somebody who was blind, or somebody who had a significant psychiatric disability, or somebody who was deaf, or many other people who are considered people with disabilities. You could not have gone to school with those people because they could not have got into the room, right? But now they can, and now you do. I'm showing a picture here, which I just really love. It's just a very simple picture of a bus or a subway train in which we've got a guy in a suit reading a book in a really nicely designed wheelchair. In other words, it's a wheelchair for transportation. It's a wheelchair that is self-propelled, and it's strapped in, as they do on public transportation, and he's probably going to work. And he's sitting in this accessible, either subway car or bus, it looks like a bus actually, next to a woman who is a black woman. She looks like she's dressed up to go to work too, talking on her cell phone, and they are with one another. So we have here a person of color, we have a woman, we have a man who has a disability, and they're simply together in the world. And this is what is created, who we share our world with, by making and building this inclusive world that we now have here together. So that's what changes, is who is in our public communities as a result of accessible design, building a world that we can all share and use together. Okay, so what can we do together to increase disability inclusion? That seems to be a question that you're asking in some of your classes that I've looked at your syllabi. I'm also I've met with some of your groups, I've met with some of you. You're interested, as many people are here, in the world in general with, as I said, DEI, or inclusion, diversity, equity, this ethical and moral imperative that has come out of the civil and human rights movement that nations undertook in the mid-20th century. So you're the inheritors of this mandate. So how can we increase disability inclusion? So here we go. You can know disability history. I've given you some of it. You can know culture. You can know justice. You can request that you teach that your teachers include these sorts of things. Histories of the civil rights movement can have a unit on disability rights, the disability rights movement. Oftentimes that falls away. So no disability history, no disability culture, I've provided some of it, and no disability justice, which means know the laws and the history of those laws. No disability technologies and use accommodations. This is really important. Disability technology or inclusive technology, the building of tools and the building of the world to make it more accessible to a wider spectrum of human embodiment and humans is everywhere once you know how to kind of watch out for it. I've given you some examples of this. Know these disability technologies and know how they might serve you and your family and your friends as you carry out your life. And as you move in and out of disability, as your family members move in and out of disability throughout your lifetime. So disability is a distinctive political and social identity because it's the most porous. That is to say, we move in and out of it, all of us, over a lifetime, in a way that we don't move in and out of our gender or ethnic or racial identities quite so comfortably, let's say. So know the technologies that are out there. Come to recognize the technologies because you will sometimes need them. And when you need them, you need to know how to request them to request an accommodation, whether that accommodation is in the form of a specific technology or in the form of a specific practice. Now, this is very tricky because people who come into disability don't often understand like what's available. They don't know what technologies are out there, and they also don't know how to ask for them. And they don't know that these technologies, and I'm talking about technologies in the broadest sense, they don't know what they need. You don't know sometimes what accommodation you need, because what happens is you suddenly run into a barrier. The barrier wasn't there. So disability is created by the encounter of a body and a world. So you come up against some kind of a barrier, and you will, and so will everyone in your life. And there it is. And you didn't know it was there, and you didn't know it was a barrier until it's there. And that's when you need to be able to know that there are technologies and there are accommodations that you can request, and that there are ways to go and find out what these are. And so make it your business to be ready to go and find that out and to ask for it and to understand that it's your right to ask for it. Okay? Practice inclusion in the workplace, or the workforce, the workplace, and the marketplace. And I'm showing a great book here written for computer designers by my colleague and friend Kat Holmes. It's called Mismatch. And it's about design and inclusive design in computer design. It's a wonderful book. And the argument in this book, and the argument in lots of places, is that disability can be brought into the workforce by hiring people with disabilities, employing people with disabilities. It can be brought into the workplace by building accessible workplace, workstations, an accessible built environment, which of course you have here because this is an educational institution. But when you go out into the work world, you might not find such an accessible environment, and in the marketplace. So this is really actually pretty interesting because people with disabilities are the largest minority group in protected minority, official minority group in the United States. And it's a lot of people with a lot of money. And so there is a market out there. And so when you go out into the work world, understand that there is a market for that people with disabilities are a market sector. And it's really important to think about how, whatever it is that you do in the world, how you can serve people with disabilities as a particular community, as a market community, as a, whatever kind of a work, when you're in education, whatever area you work in, there will be a constituency that you can serve and work with of people with disabilities. Find and support inclusive communities. I'm showing here a picture of a deaf church congregation where the service is held in American Sign Language. There are all sorts of supportive and inclusive communities that you can find and you can participate in yourself. You may want to start a disability student union here, a disability student interest group. You can do all sorts of things to find these communities that you can participate in, throughout your entire life. You can connect with disability organizations. I'm showing you an image here of a friend of mine whose name is Josh Mila, and he's very active. He's a computer engineer. He's blind, and he works with developing computer technologies for blind people, but he also has developed something called YouDescribe, which is a crowdsourced description for YouTube videos, which is really extraordinarily progressive. And he's very active with Lighthouse for the Blind. These guys are great in San Francisco, and there might be Lighthouse for the Blind in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I really don't know, but I love it. They have a sign. I have this sign up here. It says, "We're the blind leading the blind and proud of it." So, if you and your communities, individually and collectively, think about the charge that I have offered you and the practices that are available to know your history, know your technology, know your culture, know your rights, know your laws, that what this can offer is a change in attitudes, it can increase access, it can build community and cultivate leadership. And I'm going to leave you with an image here. That I love this picture. So this is a picture of my friend and colleague, Haben Girma, who is with President Barack Obama here at the White House reception at a reception at the White House for the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 2015. And Haben Girma is a first generation, I don't know quite, her parents immigrated from Eritrea, and she was born in the United States. So I guess that's first generation American. And she is, get this, the first deaf-blind person to graduate from Harvard Law School. So when I met Haben, I thought, I never even thought that a person like Haben might exist in the world. And when there were plans for this reception, the people that were involved in planning, including me, said, who are we going to get to introduce Barack Obama at this reception, at this event at the White House? And we all decided it should be Haben Girma. And so Haben introduced, these are very formal events, introduced Barack Obama. And then afterward, after she'd introduced him and, of course, introduced herself, after at the reception, this is when this photograph was taken. It was really rather remarkable because I could see that Barack Obama, it had never occurred to him, he went to Harvard Law School too, right? It had never occurred to Barack Obama that Haben Girma, and they even kind of look alike, existed in the world. And he was absolutely fascinated with communicating with her. So Haben communicates primarily by using, I don't even know what this thing's called. It's like a Braille reader where she's typing like crazy on one side of it, and then the other people would be typing on the other side, because you don't speak to Haben. She has to get her information through the computer. Although Haben speaks, actually, herself. She uses a service animal, a dog, and she's got sometimes people, and occasionally she's got people. Sometimes she does tactile signing. So she's got a whole suite of stuff around her that make it evident how somebody like that can go to Harvard Law School. And you could see that Barack Obama had never thought about that, but he was watching how somebody who's deafblind could go to and graduate from Harvard Law School. And the expression on his face was just really quite remarkable. So I wanted to end with that, which I think is really quite a lovely photograph. And interestingly enough, Joe Biden, who was vice president then, is in the background. He's a disabled president as well, with a long history of speech differences. He's a stutterer. So, and gave us Amanda Gorman, that poet that he brought forward, who is a poet who stutters, at his inaugural address. So, thank you. And perhaps we have some time before we eat those chocolate things in the back. But for Q&A, and please feel free if you need to go or if you need to, I don't know, can they eat during the Q&A?
And what was it that you used? We're going to use the appropriate technology? What was it, the amplification?
I like to say we're going to have a robust auditory environment around here.
Exactly. So if you have a question, I will bring the auditory instrument to you.
Any questions, comments? Feel free to, like I said, move around, leave, exercise.
Perfect. Can everybody hear me? Awesome. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I had a question. You really illustrated how we all move in and out of disability, and it's a very gray term. However, legally, it can be pretty black and white, especially as you're trying to get legal support. And so what does that look like to navigate those definitions?
Yes, that's what I was pointing out, in the sense that disability is a universalizing category socially and politically, but in terms of providing accommodations, that's why one has to qualify to be disabled. And that means that you have to be, as anyone who has requested accommodations through an office of access, and they have different terms for it, but usually disability services. You have to, there are gatekeepers. And that's because in order to provide accommodations, resources have to be put forward. So there needs to be gatekeeping of some kind about that. And, it's always quite clear what people need to do. And basically one needs some kind of medical authentication. And that's highly contested sometimes. And the kind of world that we want to live in is one that is built through the principles of inclusive design. And so the more inclusive the environment is with inclusive or universal design, the less need there will be for individual resource-intensive accommodations. That said, sometimes the technology is not readily available. And so I can give you one really good example. So typing and keyboarding is creating a whole generation, a whole cadre of a whole community of people with what we call repetitive stress injuries, which means that you have to stop typing. And so the accommodation for that, which is much more effective than surgery, is to stop typing and to start using voice or voice dictation, which is what I've been using forever because I've never typed. I can't do anything with a typewriter or keyboard or anything like that. So I've always used that from the beginning. So I have words in my mouth, not words in my fingers. But it's very difficult for people to make the transition from typing to speaking to create text and prose. And most schools don't provide the kind of software that needs to be used for professional level dictation. So you have to go and you have to ask for it, and it has to be put onto your computer if you need to use it. But ideally, that kind of technology, the program is called Dragon, but that kind of technology should be universally available to anybody in an educational institution. But until it is, then you have to go and you have to ask for it, and they have to pay for it, and they have to download it onto your computer. So once, as we transition into a more completely accessible world, it will be less resource dependent, and there'll be less gatekeeping to have to overcome, if you will, in order to get the technologies and the accommodations that we need. So, if that makes any sense. But it can feel onerous. And there's a lot of resistance sometimes, unfortunately. Other comments, questions? Please.
Yeah, I'm good without the microphone.
No, we're
Nope.
all going to use the mic.
We're not good without the microphone.
Universal access.
Okay.
Here I come.
No, you're good. Thank you.
There you go.
Yeah, hi, Nicholas here. What kind of legislation is currently being pursued in Congress in order to make the world more accessible for everybody? What are some prominent just legislative and legal examples that are trying to be paved forward in contemporary times in 2022?
Well, the Americans with I don't know a lot about this, but the
Do you
Americans
want it
with
to? There you go. Or you can.
No, that's fine. The Americans with Disabilities Act, of course, is an aspirational act. It's very general, very big, and it's carried out through I don't know quite how to talk about this, it's a case-by-case sort of situation where case law is established for what what counts as a disability and what counts as an accommodation. So that's really an important way, and this is ongoing all the time through the Supreme Court, for example, or through the court systems, where the Americans with Disabilities Act is being, I don't know what the word is, it's being, case law is being established, so precedents are established to talk about how the law is applied. So that's going on constantly. But one thing that's going on right now, which is extraordinarily controversial, is the question of the Supreme Court 1975 decision Roe v. Wade, which, regardless of what you think about this, I'm just trying to describe the situation here, not advocate or take a position one way or another, but one of the unintended consequences of the Roe v. Wade as what is imagined as a law that provides access to women to exercise their reproductive liberty. In other words, to make decisions about what happens to their body and what kinds of families they are going to want to make. And that's understood as basically a kind of civil and human rights kind of law. Is that one of the unintended consequences of this is that the field of reproductive testing has produced a whole series of tests that test for various risk factors for disability that can be tested in embryonic stages and also in utero. And these tests provide information about the risk for disability at a time when women still have full access to aborting on the basis of information about disability. So what's happening is that you've got a kind of collision, a moral and legal collision here around women's rights to reproductive liberty and the rights of people with disabilities to life. And this is legally and morally really complicated, and it's going to come before us, perhaps, with some laws that are they're called abortion bans laws that have been proposed in many states. I don't know if Minnesota has these laws, but a lot of them do, Ohio, Indiana, in which there is a law that has been put forward that says that it's going to be illegal to get an abortion on the basis of a diagnosis of disability. It's extraordinarily controversial, and it may come before the Supreme Court, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens. You know, whatever position you have, it'll be enormously important. So that's a disability law that one would not have ever expected. And of course, one of the issues there ethically really is that technology, and I did a lot of talk about technology now always, and it has for a long time, but it really now outstrips our capacity to create an ethical structure around how we use technology. And that's really one of the most important conversations that bioethics is asking. So, and that's just one vector of that conversation. A whole lot of stuff, artificial intelligence, you name it, asks a lot of those questions about ethics or technology development outstripping our capacity as humans to address the development and use of those technologies ethically. Long answer. Other questions, comments? Please.
Okay. I was wondering how you think the pandemic has changed our perception of disability and chronic illness. I know my own disability is an autonomic nervous system condition that's developing as a long COVID symptom.
Exactly.
And getting more research and conversation than I've ever heard before. So I was just wondering what you thought about
Yeah,
that.
there are some specific examples, of course, but in general, I think what the pandemic is illustrating to us is that it is universalizing disability, that disability is not a matter of them and us, it's all of us, and that we will all be disabled eventually, one way or another, so kind of we're all in this together. That said, of course, the pandemic has opened up the disparities in access to healthcare and healthcare use that we've all understood across the human community. So in some way, the pandemic has created more solidarity around disability, and it has also, at the same time, created more inequities around disability, and a kind of recognition that people have differential access to the goods of disability rights and disability justice. So that's that. But there have been some really interesting, very specific cases. For example, at the beginning of the pandemic, what we had was a classic bioethical issue, and that is there weren't enough respirators to go around for the sick people. And that's something that in resource-rich countries had never been a problem before. Well, it had not never been a problem. It hadn't been a problem for really a long time. But all of a sudden, there weren't enough respirators for the number of people who needed them. And so hospital systems and doctors themselves, but hospital systems and states had to go back to they had to dust off their old triage policies and see what their triage policies said about who's going to get the respirators when there aren't enough. And what was discovered, which was very interesting, is that some of these pre-ADA, some of these old triage policies said things like, if you don't have enough respirators, don't give them to people with Down syndrome. Or if you don't have enough respirators, people with mental retardation, a word that the federal government has struck down. You can't use that word anymore if you get federal funding. It had that old language and that old pre-disability rights logic. And I am telling you, in 3 minutes, there were lawsuits that came from lawyers that work at disability rights law firms in seconds, that these hospitals in these states had to rewrite these triage protocols. And it created a really important conversation across medical schools, across the government, across health and human services, about how should we equitably decide to determine who resource distribution, which is basically what healthcare always is, but this was like emergency healthcare situation. So this was a disability rights moment that would never have happened before, I don't know, 1990, but that there were these protocols that said you can basically, withhold medical treatment from people with Down syndrome, name that sort of thing. So that was one thing that happened. But then, of course, the other kinds of thing that's happening is when we're beginning to understand how vulnerability operates. The head of the CDC, Rachel Walensky, I think is her name, made a crucial mistake when she was saying just rather recently that the pandemic is not as serious as it used to be because it's really people with it's only the people with underlying conditions that are dying from it now. Well, I'm telling you, the people in the disability rights community were ferocious about this because it was understood as it was, and that is a dismissal of the people who are most vulnerable to the pandemic due to disability status. So there have been these sort of waves of new issues that have come forward, specifically in the pandemic, that has helped us understand disability and disability justice and disability equity in new ways. And in my view, to establish, I think, a little bit more solidarity, as I said, in the border between what is imagined as us and them.
I'm not trying to cut you off, but I was thinking you've done your share. And we've got stuff here and we can
That
keep
sounds good
talking
to
all
me.
amongst us, so
And I'd
thank
be
you.
happy if anybody has any individual kinds of questions to chat. But thank you so much.
Oh,
for
thank you
your
so
attention.
much.